This is a 2005 Porsche Carrera GT, and it is my all-time favorite car. I review a lot of cars, but this is my number one. In my opinion, the greatest car that's ever been put on the road. And today, I'm going to review this car and explain why. Before I get started, be sure to check out Cars and Bids, which is a new car auction website I've created to be the ultimate place to buy and sell enthusiast cars from the modern era with daily car auctions. So, if you're looking to buy or sell a modern enthusiast car from the 1980s to the 2020s, check out Cars and Bids, carsandbids.com, by clicking the link in the description below. I've borrowed this Carrera GT from a viewer here in San Diego who runs a YouTube channel called Tom's Garage. It's a small channel, but it has some good content, seeing as the owner of this car also owns a Ford GT and a Ferrari 512 TR and the BAC Mono that I reviewed last year. There's some good stuff on there. You can check out Tom's Garage by clicking the link in the description below. But let's talk Carrera GT. This was Porsche's flagship supercar in the mid-2000s, with just under 1,300 units built for the entire world. It's powered by a naturally aspirated 5.7-liter V10 with about 600 horsepower, and the original sticker price was around $450,000. But the current value is much higher. After the Carrera GT went out of production, interest was surprisingly low and prices dipped. But then supercars started switching to automatic transmissions and all-wheel drive and hybrid powertrains, and enthusiasts started to target the last analog supercars. And with a manual transmission and low production numbers and no stability control, this is one of the last, best, rarest, most special analog supercars. These days, Carrera GT models will sell between $600,000 and $1 million, or a little more for special examples. And that's a shame for me because I have always wanted one. I fell in love with the Carrera GT one of the very first times I saw one on July 15, 2005. And a decade later, I chose that date as my wedding day. I buy these little Carrera GT models at drugstores all over the world, Korea, Africa, anywhere where I happen to encounter one. And there is always a Carrera GT as the background on my cell phone. It is truly my all-time favorite car. Now, I've already reviewed the Carrera GT, but it was a long time ago, and I didn't get as in-depth back then as I do now. And so I figured it deserved a second look, especially considering how much I love this car. And so today, I'm gonna do just that. I'm gonna first take you on a thorough tour of the Carrera GT and show you all of its interesting quirks and features. Then I'm gonna get it out on the road and drive it, and then I'm going to give it a Doug score. All right, I'm going to start the quirks and features of the Carrera GT with the key, which is kind of cool, a little different from the regular Porsche key at the time. You can see it says GT at the top, letting you know that your car is special. Then you have the lock-unlock button. The other cool thing is below that you have the button to pop the trunk, and you can see they've tried to make the car diagram on that button look like the Carrera GT. You have kind of an open top mid-engine look instead of the 911. And next up, once you've unlocked the Carrera GT, you can get in using this handle here. Nothing unusual about this handle. It doesn't have like a weird trick door handle like some supercars from this era do. Just a pretty standard door handle. And once you have the door open, the first thing you see near the door sill, you have the poppers, these little switches that will pop open the rear area where the engine is and the front area, the front cargo storage area, the trunk. I'm going to start by popping open the rear compartment. Now, this rear compartment is obviously where the engine is located, but it's not only that. You take a look on the side, you can see there's this little panel here. So you undo these little fasteners on either end of the panel, you open it up, and there are some tools in here. You have tire sealant and an air compressor in case you get a flat tire. This is where your tire repair kit is located, in the engine compartment. But my very favorite item inside this compartment is this tool, this screwdriver. For one thing, it says Carrera GT on it, and on the other side it has the part number. That is the coolest screwdriver that has ever existed. But one neat feature about this, if you remove the top of this screwdriver, kind of slide it off, you have all of your different screwdriver bits on here, so you can use it for any different type of screw. You also have your tow hook in here in case the car needs to be towed. This is where you find the little towing tool you can screw into the car, and then tow drivers can use it to get the car up onto the back of a flatbed. Now, interestingly, you also have another kind of storage compartment on the other side of the engine compartment. You can see there's a little triangle on it. This one, of course, contains the warning triangle. In case you break down, you can put that out behind you to warn other drivers that you're stopped. So there's actually a little storage in this engine compartment, not just the engine. Now, there's a lot to say about the engine in this car, and I'm going to get back to it a little later. First, I want to talk about closing the engine compartment. You can see there's a little warning label kind of near the latch. That label is letting you know that your hand could get hit by the spoiler if you close it. You can see with the spoiler in this position, there's a very tight gap between the engine cover and the spoiler, and if you just keep your hand in that place, it will get pinched. So this warning label is letting you know, don't do that. Be careful. And next up, I want to talk about the front compartment. But before I do that, I want to start by discussing the luggage. Every single Carrera GT came with luggage that was fitted for all sorts of weird and interesting nooks and crannies throughout the Carrera GT. Allow me to show you. For one thing, you got a briefcase. This is the only piece of luggage that wasn't designed to fit in a perfect place somewhere in the car. But you also got a lot more than that. You can see behind the passenger seat, there's a bag. This is for a suit. If you had a suit that you wanted to kind of hang up in your Carrera GT, not let it get wrinkled, this bag was designed specifically to carry it, and this is precisely where it was intended to go. And next up, you also had a piece of luggage that went next to the passenger seat. Between the passenger seat and the door panel, this luggage piece is supposed to be placed in here for more stuff. And next up, here's a very clever one. You have this center control stack in the Carrera GT that kind of comes out towards the passenger compartment more than most cars, and that leaves a hole underneath it that would be wasted space, except you can put luggage there. And in fact, this little clip in this area is intended for the luggage. You can see that the specific bag designed for this spot has a corresponding clip on the bottom, so you can clip it in place, and then it won't kind of move around while you're driving at high speed. So there's that perfectly tailored luggage for this unusual spot. And it gets even more clever than that, because check out the inside of the door jamb area. Just looks fairly normal. This isn't a place I usually highlight, except in the Carrera GT, you can pop this open and it's a storage spot, and it has its own luggage fitted for the size of this storage spot, which is really crazy. Of course, if you don't have the luggage, you can still use this as hidden storage and nobody will ever find it. But if you have the luggage, you have your own bag that actually fits in this spot. And it's the same deal on both sides. You can see in the other door, again, pop it open, here's your hidden storage spot, and here's where you can put stuff, your fitted luggage. And of course, the final piece of luggage is up front in the front trunk, precisely where you would expect luggage to be. You just pop this open, and then you can see the luggage fits in perfectly right here. This is the largest piece of the luggage, and again, it's in the cargo compartment, so that makes sense. And next up, since I'm up here in the trunk, let's talk about the cargo compartment in this car. One notable item is that the entire trunk is lined in this soft material that has this diamond stitch pattern throughout the entire thing. This isn't some removable trunk cover. This is what's in all of the Carrera GTs, the actual trunk lining. And the reason for that is that the roof goes into the trunk, which I will show you in a second. But first, I want to talk about this little flap in the center. This is Velcroed on, and if you lift it up, you can see there's a little label here. This label shows the vehicle code 980310. That was Porsche's internal code for the Carrera GT, and it also shows all of the options and features on this particular Carrera GT using Porsche's option codes. That label is usually stuck on the inside of the trunk compartment lid in most Porsche models, but in the Carrera GT, it's located under this flap. And next up, a few other notable items in the trunk. One is that you have the tool for the center lock wheels. These wheels don't have traditional lug nuts. Instead, you have a center lock like race cars do, and this is the tool. You can see it even says Carrera GT on it, so that you know this tool doesn't go to one of your other center lock wheel cars. But probably the most interesting thing about the front trunk is the fact that you can use it to store the roof. And in true Porsche fashion, everything has been perfectly thought out with the roof removal and storage process. For one thing, there is a label printed in the cargo compartment that shows in detail precisely how the roof is intended to be removed and stored inside the car. So let me walk you through the steps right now. First, you have to move the seats forward. That seems like an odd first step for removing the roof in a car, but the latches for the roof panels are near the seat headrest area, and if the seat is too far back, you can't actually open the latch to take off the roof. Now, you have to start over on the passenger side because the roof is split into two panels, and the one on the passenger side is actually on top of the panel on the driver's side in the middle to form a seal. So you start on the passenger side, you unlatch near the headrest. As you can see, you pull this latch off, and then the process is just as simple as pulling the roof panel out, and then you're holding it. It's very light, but of course you want to be careful because this is a painted panel. Then you take that panel into the front trunk, and you can see panel number 1 is supposed to be stowed in this particular way according to the label, and so you do exactly that. Now, here's where things get even more Porsche particular detail oriented. You have straps that you're supposed to put across the roof panels when they're in the front trunk in order to secure them. And you can't just use whichever strap is more convenient. They're numbered. This is strap number 1, and it goes on top of roof panel number 1. So you have to pull this strap out and then put it on the roof panel and secure it in place. But anyway, once you've done that, you go back to the other roof panel, the one on the driver's side, and you unlatch it in the very same way. Pretty simple process. And again, you pull it off of the car and you bring it back to the front trunk. The difference here is that it actually goes the opposite direction in the front trunk. The first one had its top down, this one has its top up. And so you put it in place, and then of course you use strap number 2, and that will secure your second roof panel into your front trunk area, and then your roof is in. Now, one more interesting item with the roof panels, when they're off, you would have this kind of ugly exposed latch area that maybe you don't really want to see. So you have a little plastic cap that can slide over and cover that area. So when you're driving around in your Carrera GT, it doesn't look ugly, even if you have the roof off. And next up on the outside of this car, I want to talk wheels. Now, like I mentioned, this car has center lock wheels. Very uncommon when the Carrera GT came out. It was mostly only used for race cars, so pit crews didn't have to loosen each lug nut individually when a car came in for a pit stop. They could just do one giant lug nut in the center instead to save time. Now, these days, center lock wheels are becoming far more common on supercars and on sports cars, trying to emulate that race car look and feel, but there are still a few notable items for the Carrera GTs. For one thing, they're different colors. You can see the center lock piece on the left is this red color, and over on the right, it's a blue color. Now, this is fairly common on race cars, and the intent here is that you don't want to screw up and put the wrong thing on the wrong side of the car, and so by color coordinating it, you'll remember which side is which, and you won't make that mistake. The other unusual thing with the center lock wheels in this car is that they are cross-threaded, meaning you actually turn it to the right to loosen it or undo it. You can see there's a label on the center locks that says undo with an arrow to the right. And next up, another interesting item on the outside of this car, this little line on the side, on the front fender. This is actually the turn signal. The side turn signal in this car is this little strip. You can see when it comes on, it turns orange to signal just like you'd expect. And next up, we move around to the back of the Carrera GT, where I'm going to start with what has to be the coolest looking exhaust ever in the entire history of the car. These truly look like rocket launcher engine thrusters that you would see on a rocket ship or a fighter jet. I love these things. And the exhaust has an incredible sound to it too. One of the very best sounding exhausts in the history of the car. We'll listen to it in a few minutes. Now, a few other interesting items around back. One, the battery is not located in an easily accessible location. Instead, you have to remove the rear passenger side wheel in order to get to it. You take that off, and then there's a little access compartment, which apparently is a little difficult to access, but still, that's how you remove the battery in this car. Now, there are jump points elsewhere that are more easily accessible in case you need to jump start the car. Now, one other item worth mentioning is the color of this car. Porsche offered the Carrera GT in only 5 factory colors. There was silver, gray, black, red, and yellow. The vast majority were either silver or gray. That's most Carrera GT models you'll ever see, with silver being the most popular, and the 3 remaining colors are all pretty rare and they command a pretty substantial premium today. Later in the Carrera GT's production run, Porsche also added custom colors with their paint to sample program, so there are some custom painted Carrera GT models running around. Those are the rarest and the most valuable today. And next up, let's move inside the Carrera GT and let's talk interior. There are quite a few interesting quirks and features in here, starting with the seats. Strangely, the cushions are removable, or at least the cushion on the base is. You can hear as I kind of pull up on it the Velcro sound. You can take it out. The owner of this car, Tom, he told me that he has another cushion that can slide in here, but it's a little bit thinner. And I guess you can choose if you want the thinner or the thicker cushion, depending on if you want to sit a little higher or a little lower for your height, because the seats don't move up or down, only forward or backward. And next up, speaking of the seats, to the left of the seat on the driver's side, you have the parking brake. And if you want to engage it, you just pull it up and then it's engaged. You want to disengage it, just push it down. But when it comes to the seats in the Carrera GT, maybe my favorite thing is this little warning label in the passenger side door jamb that says "No Child Seat." Occasionally I get into supercars and exotic cars that do have child seat anchors, so you can bring your child along for the ride, but not in the Carrera GT. It is specifically prohibited. No child seat. And next up, to the left of the steering wheel, you have the ignition, which is a common thing in Porsches going back to the days of the Le Mans start in racing, where drivers would run up to their cars and drive off as fast as they could. The thinking was you would stick the key in with your left hand, put the car in gear with your right hand, and that gave you a slight advantage at the start of the race. So that's why Porsches are like that. And next to the ignition, you can see there's a little dial here. That's for the headlights. You just twist that and the headlights come on. Now, moving into the middle of the interior, at the very center, in the center control stack, you can see that you have the window switches, left and right, mounted in the center rather than on the door panels. Now at the top, you have the word Carrera GT written out in Carrera GT script, along with the serial number of the car. Now also in the middle, at the base of this center control stack, you have your climate controls. Pretty simple. At the top, you can change the temperature. In the middle, you change the fan speed. And on the bottom, you can change where the air goes. Now moving back up on this center control stack, you have near the top the hazard light button, and you can see it's this big red triangle right in the center, kind of the focal point of this entire thing, the hazard lights, but you push it and turn them on. And next up, back down in the center control stack, at the very base, you have an ashtray. It is the world's smallest ashtray, unbelievably tiny, literally like the size of a postage stamp, but it's there for all those drivers who wish to smoke in their Carrera GTs. And back further up in the center control stack, you have 3 buttons right below the hazard light button. The one on the left turns off traction control. This car was not built with stability control, but it was built with traction control. However, it's very defeatable. In fact, that traction control off button is the closest thing to the steering wheel, so you can easily turn it off. Now over on the right in this group of buttons, you have the lock button. You press that and that locks or unlocks the doors. Fairly simple. And finally, the control in the middle of this group of buttons raises and lowers the spoiler. The rear wing is adjustable, and if you press this button, you can see it goes up automatically, a very cool look. You could also press the button again, of course, if you want to lower the wing, and then it goes right back down into the car, although I've always felt that this car looks better with the wing up and in place. Now, it's worth noting that the wing also automatically will go up above 70 miles an hour. That's, I guess, the speed where Porsche thinks that the wing starts to become useful in providing downforce, like if you're on a racetrack. And finally, we move on to the most important item in this center control stack, and that would be the shift lever. For one thing, you can see the top is wood. That's a tribute to the Porsche 917 race car from years earlier, which also used a wood shift knob. Now, late in this car's model run, Porsche also started offering a carbon fiber shift knob, but in my opinion, the wood was the one you wanted for that reason, the tribute to the 917. And one other notable item about the shifter is the placement of the shifter, which is rather unusual. The vast majority of cars have kind of a more upright center control stack, and then the shifter is more in the middle in the center console. But this center control stack is pulled out in far more of a severe angle, and the shifter is closer, and that's intentional. Porsche wanted the shifter to be as close as possible to the steering wheel, so you don't have to take your hand so far off the steering wheel in order to shift gears. And so, as you can see, the shifter and the steering wheel are right next to each other, really, really close. And next up, another notable item in this interior. Like I mentioned, there's like a hole beneath the center control stack. You can see this is where Porsche has crammed the CD player in this car. Very unusual, out-of-the-way location. I guess they figured most drivers wouldn't be using it because they'd be listening to this beautiful engine note. Now, as for the radio itself, it is quite an interesting situation in this car. It's at the very top of the center control stack, and you can see it's called Porsche Online Pro, and it was designed specifically for this vehicle to fit into this spot. A few interesting items with this radio. One, you have 18 presets, 9 along the bottom, then you press this little button and it shifts to the next group of presets, so you can preset 18 radio stations in your Carrera GT, far better than in your regular average car. The other interesting item with this stereo, it's not just a radio, it's also a navigation system. I'm serious. This tiny little thing also acts as a navigation system. Press this button in the upper right with like an arrow on it, and it says navigation disc not inserted. I guess you have to put in a CD and then the navigation system would work. I can only imagine that it must be truly terrible with no real easy controls and no big screen, but it is, theoretically anyway, a navigation system in the Carrera GT. Now, one other radio-related item worth mentioning with this car are the controls right next to the radio in the center control stack. For one thing, you have this little button marked on. You can press that to turn it on. It seems totally out of place in this car, but that's what they've done for the on-off button. You also have next to that 2 dials. The dial on the left controls the volume. Obviously, you can twist it left or right for more or less volume. And then on the right, you have the radio tuner. You can twist that and it will change the radio station. You'd think they could have integrated that on button into the volume dial like everybody else, but instead you just have this weird off-center on button. Maybe the only real drawback in this interior. And next up, I want to talk about the door panel in the Carrera GT. Here you can see the door panel. There's actually nothing particularly interesting or weird or special in this door panel, but I wanted to show it so at least you could see what it looks like. I guess the door handle is kind of special. It has a cool little operation to it, and it's triangle shaped, but other than that, you just have a fairly standard door panel in this car. And next up, another interesting item in this interior is the steering wheel, because they borrowed it out of other Porsche models at the time. The 986 Boxster and the 996 911, the Boxster and 911 from the time, had this same steering wheel, and same goes for the turn signal stalk and the wiper stalks, all shared with the Boxster and the 911. In fact, the entire gauge cluster piece was shared with those cars too, the central tachometer, and then all of the other gauges over on the sides, although it's worth noting that the Boxster and the 911 didn't have a tachometer that revved to 10,000 RPMs, and the Boxster and the 911 didn't have a 225 mile an hour speedometer, but the Carrera GT does. Now, one other item worth noting in this gauge cluster, there is a small screen in the center. When you're driving along, it shows you the speed that you're traveling, but you can also use this little stalk coming off the steering column on the left to kind of scroll through various different items in here, mostly information like your trip odometer, your tire pressures, but you can also see your average fuel economy, and we're not doing so well here. 9.5 miles per gallon. Not exactly an efficient car, this one. One other interesting item in this gauge cluster screen, you can scroll through your options and one says oil, and you can get an oil level measurement in here. Strangely, this is the only way that a normal person without specialized tools can measure the oil in a Carrera GT. There's no dipstick with this car. So, unless you go to a dealership or a service center, you have to go into the gauge cluster screen to get your oil level measurement. And finally, our last interesting interior item in this car, the glove box, which actually isn't all that interesting at all. It just looks like a glove box. You open it up, but it does contain the owner's manual. The only really notable item in the owner's manual, in my view, is that it actually gives you a diagram showing where all of the luggage is supposed to go. So if you're a little confused about which piece goes where, considering there are so many strange nooks to put them in, you have this diagram to tell you. And finally, we move on to maybe this car's greatest feature of all, its engine. A 5.7-liter naturally aspirated V10 with about 600 horsepower. Now, there are many cool things about this engine, but one of the coolest is its development. It was initially developed for Formula One racing. Porsche was going to use it there. Then that didn't work out, so they kind of changed plans and developed it for Le Mans prototype racing, the LMP class cars. That didn't really work either, so they decided to stick it in a road car. So this engine traces its lineage back to development for Formula One and LMP class racing. That is just one of the coolest things you will ever hear about any road car engine in existence. Now, here's another really cool thing about the engine in this car. The concept version of the Carrera GT debuted in 2000, and it looked a lot like the eventual road car ended up looking. But the concept car had a 5.5-liter V10 with about 550 horsepower. The road car has a 5.7-liter V10 with about 600 horsepower. The road car has more power and a larger engine than the concept car. You do not see this often. Usually brands do these crazy concept cars, then they dial it back for production. Porsche was like, you know, I don't think that concept car, which didn't have to conform to any regulations, was powerful enough. So let's make the road car even faster. And they did. That's insane. But in my opinion, the very best thing about this engine is the exhaust note that comes from it. A lot of modern supercars have hybrid powertrains and whatever. They all sound good, but basically nothing sounds as good as the Carrera GT. Take a listen. And finally, a few other items worth noting in here. One, you can see the suspension in this car, inboard suspension, meaning that it's not placed directly at the wheels like basically every other car. You can actually see all the suspension components right here inside the engine bay. You can also see the carbon fiber structure of the car in here. This car largely has carbon fiber structure throughout it, and you can see some of that in the engine compartment, kind of around the engine. Everything looks really good, bold, beautiful in here, exactly like you'd expect a supercar to look. Now, the final thing I want to talk about is production numbers. Porsche made 1,270 of these. They were planning to make more, but they stopped production early for North America because they claimed that changing airbag regulations meant that production had to stop. In truth, the car simply wasn't all that successful. Back when it was new, dealerships were having a lot of trouble selling them. It was a really expensive car to have in a Porsche showroom where a 911 Turbo was maybe $150,000 with every single option. And after the car went out of production, its popularity didn't exactly increase. The global recession began near the end of 2007, continued into 08 and 09, and Carrera GT values fell along with the stock market. There are many stories of these selling in the $200,000 to $300,000 range back in 08, 09. Truly unthinkable today. These cars are worth 4 times that now. And so those are the quirks and features of the Carrera GT. But now, before I go drive it, I want to talk to Tom of Tom's Garage, the owner of this car.
Yeah.
Let's start with the obvious, Tom. How does it feel to own the greatest car ever made?
It's my best car in my collection. Every time I take it out, it's a experience.
Do you agree with me that it's the best car ever?
Oh yes, hands down.
Really?
I mean, I think it's still a bargain. I think this car is still undervalued compared to like the F40. I mean, this should be $1.5 million car easy.
Totally. We were talking about before that they've made the same number of these as F40s.
Yep.
I find this car to be just as special.
Oh yeah.
It doesn't have the Ferrari brand name.
Yep.
Enzo's last car, that sort of but if you just look at it as a rarity and specialness, this is it. This is.
And nothing sounds like this. No Ferrari, no other car sounds like this.
Absolutely
car.
Not. How often do you drive it?
I drive it once every month.
Every month.
Yep.
How long have you had it?
8 years.
8 years. So you bought it when things had dipped a little bit. Maybe they were on the upswing a little, but not where they are now.
Right. Yeah, I got it like at 340. And I know that the prices went down in the 200s.
Yeah, because this now has to be worth, what do you think, 600, 700, somewhere in that range?
Well, I had it appraised, to insure it, the guy has to come out and,
and
appraise the car. So he appraised it at $895.
Oh, God. Okay.
Even with 9,500 miles on it.
Yeah. Servicing. Talk to me about servicing. You can't, well, maybe you can. Bring it to a Porsche dealer. What do you do?
You can take it to some dealers that have, qualified mechanics that work on it.
Yeah.
Like doing oil change and stuff like that. But you just want to make sure you're taking it someplace where they've got a history and you have people. There's a small crowd of people that own these cars, and we all know where to take
which are the
cars.
stores to go to. Okay.
Yeah.
Are there specialists that have popped up that are taking care of these?
Well, there's a specialist in Fairfield, Connecticut, which I'm going to. For engines out or any major work, it's worthwhile. I mean, I know that people ship their cars to them from all around the world. Okay, and so and that's a component of this. Every few years, the engine is supposed to come out. Well, yes, it's supposed to. This engine is supposed to come out some time ago. It's it's got 9,500 miles on it. It's never been out. They need to pull it out to check the valve settings and other issues. So what is every decade or something that's supposed to come out? Something like that? Yeah, every decade, but Nobody's done that. No, most people haven't done it. Most people have just socked them away and aren't touching them. And so a lot of these cars probably are deferred maintenance cases that need some work. Yeah, probably so. And I mean, if you're going to take it in, it's going to be a $30,000 to $40,000 hit. Yeah, so let's talk about this. So you actually plan to ship it to Connecticut where there is this specialist in the Carrera GT world. This guy is known as the guy. Yeah. You're going to ship it clear across the country to get all this work done. Yeah, I had considered driving there. But... Okay, one of the big points about this car obviously is the controversy, the dangerousness, the scariness of the driving experience. Have you personally felt that? No. I know my limits. Yeah. I know my talents. Tires is a component though, right? Yes. The original tires people say were hairy and everybody has since replaced them. Yeah. And plus they were old tires from the Paul Walker incident. That was old tire. They were 10 years old. Right. So, you need to stay on top of tires no matter what. Yeah. And particularly a car like this. Right. Rubber does get hard over time. You said this is your favorite car of your vehicles, the best car in your group. Yeah. Does it still, you've had it for almost 10 years, 8 years, does it still give you a thrill to drive it? Oh yeah. I mean, it's just not how it feels when you drive it. I mean, the car is well engineered. Yeah. It's a beautiful automobile. There's nothing quite like it. I mean, the Germans went all out for this automobile. Totally. Yeah. Are you ready? I am. Are you scared? Nope. Yeah, well, we'll see. I'm going to be very careful and cautious. All right, thanks, Tom. Let's get it out on the road and see how it drives. Okay, driving the Carrera GT. My opinion, the greatest car ever made. It's such a thrill. I've done this now. This is the second time. And I still feel the same amount of pressure. I feel like more nervous and excited and anxious and just so much energy than in just about any other car. Koenigsegg, Pagani.
this for me is that for so many other people. Now, I want to start by talking about the clutch. The clutch is a common topic of conversation with this car. And there is a little bit of a weird thing to it in the sense that you have to let it out pretty far before you start accelerating, only in first gear, only from a dead stop. This doesn't feel that unusual. And there's a lot of talk about how weird that is and how hard it is to get used to, but you drive in this car, you're careful anyway. You're already being careful. You're waiting until that clutch comes out because you don't want to ride it when you're going. And by the way, regarding the clutch with this car, it's really a fantastic thing. The clutch is great, perfectly weighted, not heavy, not springy, just a wonderfully easy linear travel. But the real star is the gear lever. The gear lever, even though this is such an intimidating car with a V10 and blah, 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 it just doesn't feel like that when you're shifting gears. It feels like a happy-go-lucky little sports car. You can just kind of toss around the gear lever with no problem. Listen to that. I truly think this is probably the best sounding car I've ever driven, except for maybe the Lexus LFA, which also has a V10 and sounds more kind of Formula One-ish. It's so easy to rev and to rev match in this car because it revs so quickly. With no flywheel, with this little clutch, it's unbelievable how quickly it revs so fast, and so you can rev match so easily on downshifts. You feel like a hero when you're rev matching. You feel like you know what you're doing. Now this car, like a lot of carbon fiber construction cars, you do feel a lot. It's very tight. You feel a lot of road. You hear a lot of stuff. There's a lot to it. It's certainly, this is not a daily driver type car. Now, one cool thing about this car that I've always loved, because it was built by Porsche, it just feels to me to be a better car than a lot of the cars that were, a lot of the other high dollar crazy supercars. It's really well built. This car is 15 years old. Nothing's coming apart. Nothing looks bad. Nothing's poorly constructed. This was built, it's the same thing with my Ford GT. It was built by a company that builds rational automobiles, and so they kind of know how to do that sort of stuff. The other benefit of the Porsche manufacturing is that it's actually pretty reasonably sized in here. The seat feels good. I've got a lot of headroom, even though I'm tall. I have a good amount of space in this car. It's not as exciting or as daring as some cars. You get in an Enzo, everything's a little more insane. This car is not as crazy. Like I said, the steering wheel's from a Boxster, but that wasn't really the point. Now, Tom says he doesn't worry about the danger level of this car, but I certainly do. I really think that this car is dangerous, and you have to know what the hell you're doing, especially when it's this valuable. This sound! Oh, God, it just feels so tight. The steering is just so tight. Everything about it. And it's just it's so quick to rev. It still feels fast. Even though 3.6 0 to 60 is no longer the fastest thing on the road. Oh, the sound is so good. You just feel so special. It's a totally different experience, and the car is so drivable. I just feel like you feel like a hero. You feel like you know what you're doing in this car so much more than in so many other cars that have a getting used to period. Even though this is an incredibly expensive car that requires some skill to drive, it makes you feel like you've driven it forever and like you know what you're doing. It drives like a Porsche. It just happens to have a V10 with 600 horsepower and no stability control and the history that it does. And so that's the Porsche Carrera GT. In my mind, this is the last best analog supercar. And given the lawsuits this car generated and the controversy that surrounds it, I suspect there will never be another car made quite like this. That's okay though, because in my mind, it's perfect. I just wish I could afford it. Anyway, with that in mind, now it's time to give the Carrera GT a Doug score. Now, since I've already Doug scored the Carrera GT, I'm not going to go through each category, but rather I'm just going to show you where it stands against some other iconic cars and supercars from its era, which is right here, 71 out of 100, which puts it near the top and better than basically everything else from the mid-2000s. The Carrera GT is an absolute legend. It's fun to drive, it's well built, it sounds amazing, it's special, it's rare, and in my opinion, it's still undervalued. It is my all-time favorite car, and with good reason.